The PlayStation 3, a console which brings back nostalgia for many. A console ahead of its time in many ways, while simultaneously being notorious for very sensitive components that are very failure prone. And today, I'm going to be doing my best to fix that, upgrading every part of the PS3 and putting together an overkill water cooling system for it. And by the end, I believe I can say that I have the ultimate PS3. Water cooling a console has been a dream of mine for a very long time. It is something that I've always wanted to do, from my first console, the PS4, until today. Yet, I've never had a reason or the funds to see my dream come to life. However, the PS3 being notorious for its thermal issues and its extremely loud fans seemed like a prime candidate to see my dream come true. Of course, this all started back in January when I made my first video on this topic, when I first got my backwards compatible PS3 that I had wanted for so long. In the video, I replaced all the thermal pads, the thermal paste, cleaned all the dust from it, and tried to refurbish my PS3 the best I could. But I made a multitude of mistakes and left out a lot of things that I shouldn't have. First of all, I used a really cheap, crappy SSD, a Kingston SSD without a DRAM cache. I used the extremely dangerous eraser mod notorious for killing PS3s. I did not delid the CPU or GPU out of fear of breaking the console, and of course, it had the failure-prone 90nm GPU in it still. Soon after that video, however, I set out to right my wrongs, and I began drafting plans to make the ultimate PS3. A new, awesome SSD, water cooling, and a GPU upgrade. A GPU upgrade, you ask? Well, if you haven't heard by now, the PS3 has a GPU called the Reality Synthesizer, RSX for short. And basically, the first generation of these PlayStation 3s was on the 90nm process node, which, for reference, the Ryzen 9000 chips rumored to come out this year are on a 4nm process node, over 20 times smaller. This gigantic process node was horribly inefficient and notoriously unreliable, with estimates that 90% of yellow lights of death from the PS3's first generation come from GPU problems. Not too long ago, however, a method originally pioneered by Sony repair centers to fix dead PS3s hit the market, in which you can take a GPU from a slim PS3 on a 65 or 40nm process node and swap it out on the older model, which of course makes your console infinitely more reliable. And as I was in the search for an ultimate PS3, this mod obviously had to be done. So I reached out to a guy on eBay, which if you watch my video about the modded Nintendo Switch, you'll know that I get most of my soldering and modding work done on eBay, for better or for worse. It took 2.5 months and cost a fortune, roughly $400 after taxes, fees, and shipping, but it was worth it. But after I received everything and unboxed it, I was ready to set out to work on my PS3 once more. The first mod I did was extremely simple, and it was the first thing I did after taking it out of the box and making sure it still worked. I replaced my Kingston 256GB SSD, an SSD that does not have a DRAM cache, making it especially bad for longevity and performance, with a Samsung 870 EVO 1TB, the cream of the crop for SATA SSD. This is a significant upgrade that I recommend everyone doing. But everyone's first rebuttal is, well, the PS3 is only SATA 1, meaning it can't take advantage of an SSD. However, you're wrong. First of all, a traditional hard drive is never going to max out the SATA interface, meaning that the hard drive is the bottleneck, and you are relieving that bottleneck, even though you are passing it on to the SATA port. Since hard drive can really only muster about 50 to 100 megabytes per second, you're still doubling your speeds even with the SATA bandwidth cap. And moreover, for gaming, what's more important is random read and write speeds, and that is always going to be below the SATA data cap. Therefore, when you download PS3 games digitally on a SATA SSD, you have almost no problems with texture pop-in, and it loads significantly faster. And of course, after testing for a little bit further to make sure everything worked fine, I was off to the races to start my water cooling build. The first thing I did was take the cheap Chinese universal water blocks I got off of Amazon and modded them to be able to mount onto my PS3. Thankfully, with a little bit of modification, I was able to mount them to the original mounting holes, making everything more stable and professional looking. Next, I cut the motherboard cage to make room for the water blocks. However, I rigged up a horrible mounting system that used a lot of the original hardware to mount it, including the leaf spring that came from the factory. Thus, my mounting system was really wobbly and resulted in the integrated heat spreaders on the CPU and GPU being able to move nearly freely. However, at the time, seemingly I thought this was okay and went on with the water cooling build anyway. I used low profile right angle adapters to make sure that my CPU blocks could fit within the PS3, meaning that now the tubes just came out the back, and from the front this PS3 looks virtually indistinguishable from a stock PS3, something that I really wanted to do since most custom builds to me just look ugly, or come with obvious disadvantages like height factors or not being able to stand on their side. Now, something I'm very proud of on this console is my electrical work. I have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to circuits. However, after a little bit of research, I was able to devise a plan to try to fix some of the glaring flaws in water cooling a console. See, the first problem that comes to mind when you water cool a console is, how are you going to power it? Well, the obvious answer is with an external ATX power supply. But then the question becomes, how are you going to power it on? Well, simply by shorting 2 pins in the power supply's 24-pin motherboard connector, you can make it turn on no matter what. However, this creates another problem. Is it always going to be running? Am I going to have to turn it on separately from the PlayStation? However, my design can do you one better. See, hijacking the 12-volt signal from the fan connector on the PS3's motherboard and using something called an optocoupler, a type of relay which uses light to match the state of a circuit on either side. I made a system where when the PS3 turns on and tries to spin up a fan that is no longer there, it will, by itself, turn on the external ATX power supply. And just for clarification purposes, just before you do anything stupid, do not just straight up plug the 12 volt and ground pins into your power supply connector. You are going to start a fire. An optocoupler uses light to electrically isolate each of the circuits, so there's no cross-contamination here. Because if that wasn't the case, I would have never done this mod, since I have no idea what I'm doing beyond this very simple modification. Even cooler than that, pun not intended, is from the same connector, I was able to steal the PS3's power width modulation, or PWM for short, signal that's used to power the original fan, and sent the signal to a fan, allowing the PS3 to independently control all 5 external fans. Now, all of this sounds horribly complicated, but I promise you it's not. I'm going to have a very crude circuit drawing up on the screen now for you to copy, and amazingly, after putting everything back together, it actually worked. It launched, and I was able to play The Last of Us with the temperature staying around the mid-30s. This, combined with the fact that it was virtually silent, made me so excited. However, there was a problem, because the next morning when I went to turn the PS3 on, it sat on the home screen for a couple minutes before it just turned off. Now, it did so with flashing red light and 3 beeps. Now, I thought this was due to overheating, so I took the PS3 apart, and to my horror, when I opened it up again, the CPU die hadn't been making full contact with the integrated heat spreader. Thanks, I'm surely, due to the absolutely awful mounting system that I had in place at the time. However, I didn't actually reform the mounting system, I just tried to align it up a little better and get the screws a little tighter, and proceeded to have the same issue. I took it back apart thinking this was still an overheating issue, and I completely revamped the mounting system, which is something that I should have done from the original part. I also refined the internal electronics to make them a little better, and I added 2 40mm Noctua fans to blow inside the console. That being something that you should really focus on, and I wish I would have focused on more, because almost all of the components inside the PS3 that used to have a fan blowing over them now don't, and need some type of cooling to not harm themselves. However, after completely revamping the internals and putting it back together, I still had the same issue. I was getting ready to call it quits, because I thought that it was the CPU of my PS3 causing these problems. And when your CPU dies on a PS3, there's nothing you can do that doesn't cost thousands of dollars, much more than it would cost to just replace the system outright. But you're not going to believe what was causing it. It was software. See, a piece of custom software that I use with my jailbroken PS3 called Webman has an FPS and temperature overlay that you can show on the screen by using a simple shortcut L3R3 on your controller. And after a little bit of researching, I actually found out this is a documented issue, that on these older model fat PS3s, this overlay causes a yellow light of death. For some reason, it isn't permanent and it only happens when you turn the overlay on, meaning that it was completely reversible and there was really nothing wrong with my PS3. But this video was this close from not coming out. Now, the last part is one of my absolute favorite things to do, and you will know it well if you watch my Nintendo Switch video that I was talking about earlier, link in the description. Overclocking. EvilNav, which is the custom firmware of my choice for the PlayStation 3, has a version of its software which overclocks the GPU from 500 MHz to 600 MHz and also gives a nice boost to VRAM clocks. However, this is where my warning comes in. Do not, in any uncertain terms, overclock an original fat PS3. Ever, for a multitude of reasons. First of all, as we mentioned earlier, the 90nm process node on this GPU is inherently unstable, and overclocking it will only shorten its lifespan even further. Moreover, these PS3s have a serious problem with power consumption that could lead to the power supply failing over time, and this is all on top of the fact that thermal issues are almost guaranteed if you overclock, since they're normally bad anyways. And you don't want your PS3 to sound more like a jet engine than it probably already does. However, if you were paying attention, you know that this model solves for basically all of those problems. First of all, the GPU is on a much newer and more stable architecture of a 40nm GPU. It also conveniently consumes less power, giving me a little bit of headroom, and it has overkill water cooling, meaning that thermals basically are not an issue. So, being me, I of course went ahead with the overclock anyways. Let me just say, the difference is amazing. Most demanding games that had really bad dips like Dead Island and The Last of Us had much less FPS problems. And there's a series on YouTube which I'll show here and link in the description which compares games before and after overclocking on the PS3. And it is amazing to find that some games have a difference of 5 to 10 FPS basically all around. And this is because the PS3 is heavily GPU limited, because the CPU is extremely ahead of its time and still pretty powerful to this day. And after all that time, I think I can definitively say that I have the ultimate PS3. There are a few upgrades that I could do for niche longevity purposes, like upgrading or replacing the power supply, replacing the NEC tokens, or an upgrade which I purposely refrain from, which is installing a 2TB hard drive. See, with a little bit of manipulation, you can actually get up to 1.5 terabytes of storage on a PS3. However, this makes the file system become unstable, and in some cases you can completely corrupt your PS3 by doing this, which it's recoverable, but it's still not something that I want to toy with, especially because I have so many physical disks that it really does not matter. But it is quieter, cooler, smoother, and loads faster than any other PS3 on the market. And it can play PS1, PS2, and PS3 games with basically no exceptions. The PS3 is a beast, way ahead of its time in so many ways. However, you can draw historical parallels between this and something like a King Tiger 2, which despite its technological superiority in some ways, it was limited heavily by weird faulty components and shortcomings on the design. The CPU, as I mentioned earlier, is insanely powerful even today, but because of its weird architecture, it took a lot of development skills, time, and money to get the most out of it. And because of its weaker GPU that was failure prone, almost every single game ran better on the Xbox 360 throughout this generation. All of that is to say, I still think you should buy a PS3 in 2024 to experience this generation of games if you have not. However, I would highly recommend that you get a PS3 Slim of a variety that can be jailbroken, because this will cause you a lot less headaches and cost a lot less money. And I believe that brings us to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like down below and subscribe to help me hit my goal of 800 subscribers by the end of April. Thank you so much for watching.